The first time I saw the lights moving beneath me, I thought they were part of my own gear, until they changed shape and formed something that looked almost curious. That was the moment I realized why the Mariana Trench diving program forces us to follow 11 strange rules. Rules so specific and so unforgiving that even remembering them makes my chest tighten. I remember the first time I broke one of them, how the water around me seemed to breathe, how something bright and silent drifted closer, as if it had been waiting. And now I keep wondering why those lights came back last night, and why they were higher than before. I remember the first time I almost broke Rule 1. Never look directly at the lights if they stop moving. As I descended into the Mariana Trench, the water pressing cold and silent around me like a living thing. My flashlight barely cut through the murky blue, and beneath me, a strange glow hovered in the distance, still but almost knowing I was watching. My heart thumped harder as I debated whether it was safe to keep observing, or if I should turn my back and move on. But curiosity rooted me in place, tightening my chest with dread. Every movement of the glow seemed deliberate, almost teasing, as if it could sense hesitation and feed on it. I told myself it was just reflection or bioluminescent life, but the way the lights remained perfectly still made me question everything I thought I knew about the deep. As I drifted further down, the pressure of the water seemed heavier with every meter, squeezing my lungs and my thoughts alike, while the glow below refused to waver, like it had been waiting for me to commit a mistake. I had to keep reminding myself of the basic training drills. Never reach out, never panic, never let the lights fixate you. Even the smallest twitch of my head toward that steady shimmer sent a shiver crawling along my spine. It wasn't just a light anymore, it had intention, and instinctively I wanted to look away, but my eyes betrayed me, dragging me back, hypnotized by the quiet, deadly patience of it. Something about the way it pulsed ever so slightly gave me a feeling that whatever this was, it was alive and aware of me. The further I moved, the darker the water became, swallowing the edges of my vision, and the glow, still unmoving, seemed to stretch further into the abyss, as if marking a path I wasn't meant to follow. I whispered into the comms, "Do you see this?" But the response was only a static hum, punctuated by the tiny bubbles escaping my suit. I had been warned countless times that the Mariana Trench had its own rhythm, its own predator senses, and that Rule 1 wasn't just a guideline but a literal survival mandate. Every time I glanced sideways, the light shifted slightly, just enough to make my stomach twist, as if the trench itself was nudging me toward the edge of caution. My fingers twitched toward my console, measuring depth, oxygen, my heart rate, anything to distract from the hypnotic presence below. Time seemed to stretch like a slow current, the minutes turning into hours, each pulse of that light exacting a toll on my awareness, sharpening every nerve in my body. My buddy's voice finally cut through, shaky, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" And I swallowed the lump in my throat. I couldn't answer without revealing my own fear, and I realized that this rule was not just about not looking, it was about restraint, about survival, about keeping your mind intact when the trench whispers that you are already too late. I tightened my grip on the tether and adjusted my orientation, forcing myself to look slightly away, feeling a pressure in my chest, as if the lights had noticed my deliberate defiance. Every fiber of me screamed to look again, and every fiber of me screamed to resist. The trench walls curved around me, like frozen waves, guiding the glow ever deeper into a canyon I didn't remember charting. My thoughts spun around Rule 1, trying to cling to logic as the light seemed almost sentient, pulsating in a rhythm that my oxygen monitor could never match. I whispered to myself, "It's just light, it's just water," but the hesitation in my voice betrayed me, and I felt a presence brush past my suit like a cold breath, intangible but undeniable. I had seen similar effects on training dives, shadows that played tricks on your mind, but this was different. This was deliberate, calculated, and I felt its awareness sharpen with every hesitant glance I risked. I tried to tell my own rational mind that it was probably nothing more than a deep-sea creature, but the patience in its stillness made my imagination spin out of control. As I navigated around a ridge, I kept catching glimpses of the light in the corner of my vision, unmoving, unwavering, as though daring me to break Rule 1 entirely. My hands shook slightly in the gloves, trying to maintain control over my instruments and my breathing. I reminded myself that if I lost focus, even for a second, the trench could swallow me silently, without a single trace left behind. I felt my heartbeat in my throat as I remembered stories from previous expeditions, divers who ignored rules like this and vanished without explanation, leaving nothing but deep water and faint echoes in their wake. The glow stretched and pulsed subtly, just enough to make me believe that something was following me, though I kept telling myself it was my own imagination, strained by pressure, isolation, and fear. I forced myself to glance sideways, catching a hint of its form in my peripheral vision, and the pulse seemed to react instantly, contracting like a living eye. My mind raced as I calculated every movement, every breath, knowing that Rule 1 was not about what you could see, but about what could see you. The trench was deceptively silent, yet I could feel vibrations creeping along the hull of my suit, subtle currents that whispered of something massive moving nearby. I tried to stay calm, repeating in my head, do not look, over and over like a mantra. The lights below did not flicker, did not waver. They simply observed, patient and silent, waiting for me to slip. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed as I inched through the canyon, the glow always slightly ahead, teasing with its static pulse. The temperature dropped, making my hands stiff inside the gloves, and I realized I hadn't blinked in minutes, eyes fixed nervously on my instruments, to avoid looking directly at the lights. I had to remind myself again that Rule 1 was there for a reason. Breaking it could be fatal. I felt my chest tighten with every passing second, an invisible weight pressing against my ribs, as though the trench itself were testing my resolve. My mind threatened to unravel, and I could almost hear it laughing silently at my hesitation. I drifted past a sharp ridge, and the glow finally shifted, just a fraction, enough to suggest it was aware of my every thought. I whispered aloud to myself, just don't look, but my own voice trembled and echoed faintly in my helmet. The realization hit me cold. Even small mistakes mattered here, and I had been flirting with them for hours. The trench was patient, but I was not, and every pulse of that unmoving light felt like a countdown I could not see. I adjusted my buoyancy, letting myself drift slightly sideways to keep the light out of my direct line of sight, my chest heaving as I clutched the tether. By the time I reached a safer depth where the glow was dimmer, my body was trembling from adrenaline, and I realized I had learned the first lesson of the trench in the hardest way possible. Even from afar, even for a brief second of curiosity, that unmoving light had demanded my attention, testing my will, my patience, and my sanity. I whispered one last time, never again, as I adjusted my instruments and prepared for the next leg of the descent, knowing deep inside that the lights were only the beginning of what the Mariana Trench had in store for me. The faint glow lingered at the edge of my vision, and I felt the heavy weight of Rule 1 settle into my mind with an almost living intensity. The moment I adjusted my buoyancy, after narrowly surviving the pulse of the unmoving glow, I felt the weight of the trench pressing harder against my chest, like a living reminder of Rule 2. Never remove your helmet below 3,000 meters. My hands shook slightly as I ran through my oxygen levels and double-checked the seals, remembering stories from divers who thought the rule was paranoia, until the cold crushed them in silence. The deeper I went, the smaller and more fragile the feeling of control became, and even minor mistakes now carried the threat of instant death. My buddy drifted ahead, his flashlight tracing weak arcs through the water, and I wondered if he was equally haunted by the notion that taking off the helmet here was an unthinkable risk. The trench didn't forgive curiosity or carelessness. It only watched and waited for the wrong move. I pushed onward along a narrow ridge, the glow from before nowhere in sight, yet the memory of it still clinging to my senses like a warning. Every bubble that escaped my suit seemed amplified in the oppressive silence, and I could feel the difference in pressure between the crevices and open water, a subtle yet insistent squeeze that reminded me why Rule 2 existed. The water at this depth wasn't just cold, it was liquid steel, pressing against every inch of me and promising instant oblivion if the helmet was compromised. I thought about the divers who had come before me and how the trench had a cruel way of teaching lessons. One minute they were confident, the next they were gone. The thought alone made me tighten the strap under my chin, even though I was already strapped as securely as humanly possible. As I drifted further into the canyon, the lights of my instruments cast pale circles across the trench walls, revealing jagged ridges and the occasional shadow of unknown creatures darting in and out of view. My fingers grazed the console to adjust the oxygen flow, reminding myself again why Rule 2 was so critical. A tiny crack in the helmet could flood me instantly. The water at this depth had no mercy, and even the smallest lapse could be fatal. I tried to slow my racing thoughts, breathing in measured intervals, telling myself to focus on the readings, the tether, the subtle currents, anything to stay grounded. Yet my eyes kept drifting toward dark hollows where bioluminescent creatures occasionally winked, shapes that seemed too deliberate to be natural, as if testing me like the trench itself was a predator judging my discipline. Hours passed with me inching forward, scanning my instruments and surroundings with obsessive caution, feeling the mental fatigue of the deep setting in. The helmet weighed heavier on my head than usual, every movement of my neck a reminder of the fragile barrier between me and instant death. I imagined the pressure outside as fingers pressing through the thin layer of metal and glass, ready to crush the unprepared, and the memory of other divers' mistakes flashed in my mind. Someone had once joked that the trench didn't need to reach in to kill you, it just let gravity, cold, and isolation do it. I had laughed during training, but now I understood. The rule was there to protect not only life but sanity, keeping divers from even considering reckless exposure to the crushing abyss. A sudden flicker of movement caught my peripheral vision, something darting between the ridges, unnervingly silent yet disturbingly precise. I forced myself to ignore it, focusing on the tether and the steady rhythm of my breathing, but the pulse of fear ran through me like electricity. I whispered into the comms, "Stay close, keep your helmet secure," half for my buddy and half as a reminder to myself. The trench seemed alive with anticipation, and every adjustment I made reminded me of Rule 2. The helmet wasn't just protection, it was the only barrier between you and a death that could arrive in silence, without warning, without spectacle. I imagined even a tiny crack letting in the water and felt a shiver run through my body, forcing me to double-check seals, straps, and valves. The canyon opened slightly, revealing a wider expanse where shadowed shapes drifted lazily in the distance, impossible to identify yet distinctly moving with intelligence. I knew that exposure here, even by a moment's lapse, could be catastrophic. The trench had a way of teaching lessons in extremes. I reminded myself to maintain mental focus, not to let curiosity or instinct override the rules designed to keep me alive. I thought about Rule 1 and how close I had come to breaking it, and now Rule 2 demanded even more discipline, a tangible barrier against the invisible threats that hovered beneath the faint glows in the water. I felt a cold press of tension in my chest, and realized that survival depended entirely on respecting boundaries, even when they felt arbitrary to the uninitiated. Hours blended into one another, my mind a haze of pressure readings, oxygen levels, and subtle cues from the trench walls. I drifted past a jagged ridge, each step deliberate, every movement calculated, each glance outward a test of restraint. I could feel my senses straining, the isolation gnawing at my resolve, the depth warping my perception of time and space. Every shift in the current, every flicker of light in the distance, demanded vigilance. Rule 2 wasn't just a guideline, it was a lifeline. I had to keep the helmet sealed, my movements steady, my thoughts in check, or risk being swallowed instantly. And the trench seemed to be testing me, nudging at my concentration, teasing with glimpses of shadows and faint flickers of bioluminescent glows that made the airless water feel alive. As I rounded another ridge, the glow returned, distant and still, almost as if mocking me for having survived the first encounter. I forced my eyes to remain on instruments, on tethers, on anything but the light, knowing that breaking Rule 2 here would be a fatal mistake. My heart raced with both fear and relief. I had survived moments that might have destroyed others, yet the trench seemed aware of my confidence, preparing to punish even the smallest lapse. I whispered a silent promise to myself. No matter how tempting curiosity became, the helmet would remain on, the seal intact, and my focus unwavering. The abyss stretched endlessly, and I understood the true weight of the rule. Survival depended not on luck, but discipline and respect for boundaries designed by forces far greater than me. The current shifted suddenly, brushing my suit like cold fingers through the tether, and I froze, recalling every tale of divers who had underestimated the depth. The trench had no patience for error, and the helmet was more than protection. It was the only thing keeping me tethered to life. I adjusted my buoyancy carefully, allowing myself only minimal movement, knowing that even the slightest overreach could result in catastrophic flooding. Every pulse of adrenaline reminded me why Rule 2 existed, and why previous divers' mistakes were still studied and warned about in every briefing. The trench had memory, awareness, and patience, and my survival depended entirely on my adherence to rules that often felt suffocating, yet were undeniably necessary. By the time I reached a slightly safer corridor, the glow seemed to recede, but my muscles and mind remained taut, every nerve screaming in anticipation of what the trench might reveal next. I glanced at my buddy, who floated silently ahead, both of us aware that the abyss watched in silence, calculating, and waiting for the tiniest lapse. I knew that the remainder of this dive would test my focus, my restraint, and my very sanity. Rule 2 had been my first tangible barrier against death's sudden grasp, and now, every next move would demand even more vigilance. The trench wasn't done with me, it had just begun to observe. Even as I adjusted my helmet and reminded myself of the suffocating importance of Rule 3, always keep the tether taut, or risk losing your orientation. The trench seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and unyielding, swallowing any sense of direction I thought I had. My fingers tightened around the cord instinctively, feeling every slight tug or slack as if the line itself were alive, warning me of the abyss below. The walls of the trench curved like impossible cliffs, shadows drifting lazily across the jagged surfaces, and I realized that losing focus for even a moment could send me spiraling into nothingness. My flashlight, the faintest beam in this living darkness, barely touched the ridge ahead, but every flicker reminded me of how crucial the tether was, a lifeline in a place designed to erase all sense of up and down. I whispered into the comms, "Stay close, don't let go," half for my own reassurance, half to remind my buddy that the line connected us to sanity and survival. As I drifted forward, the pressure and cold seemed almost sentient, pressing in with every heartbeat, and I felt the subtle tug of the tether reminding me that the trench demanded discipline. Shadows shifted unnaturally at the edge of my vision, indistinct shapes that appeared to drift with a rhythm not entirely dictated by the current. I reminded myself again that even a minor lapse, slack in the line, a second's distraction, could throw me into a spin from which there was no recovery. Each movement had to be deliberate, measured, controlled. The tether wasn't just a safety device, it was the only constant in a place that denied all other points of reference. I could feel my own fear feeding into every decision, every calculated adjustment, knowing that the abyss was aware of my slightest misstep. The deeper I moved into the canyon, the more the tether seemed to guide me in ways my mind couldn't comprehend, curving around jagged ridges and through hidden channels that the light could barely penetrate. I had to constantly reassess my orientation, knowing that even a small slack could disorient me in this alien environment. My buddy's flashlight flickered against the trench walls, revealing fleeting glimpses of crevices and unexpected overhangs, reminding me that the tether wasn't simply for navigation, but for survival itself. The glow from before had disappeared, yet the memory of it lingered, making every shadow seem alive, every movement potentially fatal. I whispered to myself. "Keep it taut, always taut," as I adjusted my grip, feeling the steel wire vibrate subtly, alive with tension, almost like it had its own heartbeat, synchronized with the trench. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, as I traced the line carefully, every muscle tensed, every thought focused solely on maintaining connection to the tether. I thought about divers who had lost their orientation and vanished into the depths, leaving only floating gear and haunting echoes behind. The Mariana Trench had a cruel, methodical way of teaching lessons, and Rule 3 was one of the first. It demanded respect for both the environment and the fragile human life navigating it. Each pull or slack reminded me that I was no longer in control. The tether dictated the rhythm, forcing me to adjust, to breathe, to remain present. A sudden shift in the current tugged at my suit, and I felt a jolt run through my body, evidence that even at this depth, the trench had mechanisms I could neither predict nor fight. I rounded a ridge and caught sight of faint bioluminescent pulses from creatures lurking just beyond visibility, their movements deliberate and measured, like they were observing me as much as I was observing them. The tether hummed against my gloves, a tangible reminder of Rule 3, and I realized that even in my panic, the line forced me to slow down, to measure, to survive. I drifted closer to my buddy, our lines taut and parallel, the connection between us barely a whisper through the water. I kept repeating in my mind the mantra of the tether, silently willing myself to remain calm, focused, disciplined. One misstep, one slackened moment, and the abyss would claim me without hesitation. The trench had no mercy, no patience for error. As the canyon opened wider, I noticed how the tether guided me past subtle currents that threatened to push me off course, and I marveled at the delicate balance between pressure, movement, and survival. Each tug, each vibration, communicated warnings I could only interpret through attention and experience. I remembered previous warnings. Divers who ignored this rule ended up spinning in disorientation, trapped in loops where the walls of the trench seemed to shift endlessly around them. The tether wasn't just a rope, it was a lifeline, a connection to reality, and the only thing keeping me from becoming another ghost of the Mariana Trench. My breathing was measured, slow, deliberate, as I adjusted my orientation and followed the taut line like a ritual, fully aware that one slip could erase everything. Hours passed in the unrelenting darkness, each moment amplifying the importance of Rule 3. I forced myself to remain conscious of the tether, not just as a guideline, but as the only certainty in a world that had none. Shadows flickered at the edges of vision, strange shapes drifting lazily or darting suddenly through crevices, and I could feel a quiet dread building, a sense that the trench was alive and aware of my every action. I whispered a silent prayer to the line, feeling almost superstitious in its presence, aware that it was as much a psychological anchor as it was a physical one. The further I went, the more the tether demanded attention, stretching across unseen obstacles and guiding me through unseen hazards that could easily end a dive in seconds. I drifted into a narrower channel, the walls of the trench closing in on either side, pressing in visually, if not physically. The tether hummed with tension, as if resonating with the deep, silent energy around me. I adjusted my grip, moving slowly, feeling the wire vibrate against jagged surfaces, always reminding me of Rule 3. My buddy flickered into view, a muted silhouette, and I realized that even our combined presence was fragile in this environment, dependent entirely on the taut lines that anchored us to life. The currents twisted subtly around ridges and rocks, each pull a reminder that control here was an illusion, and that the tether's tautness was the only barrier between me and the vast, unrelenting darkness. By the time we reached a wider expanse where the trench dropped into deeper shadows, I felt the psychological weight of every tug and slack, understanding that Rule 3 wasn't just about orientation, it was about discipline, awareness, and survival under conditions that mocked human vulnerability. I whispered to myself, again and again, that letting the line slack, even for a heartbeat, could mean vanishing into the trench forever. The bioluminescent pulses of creatures in the distance seemed to pulse in tandem with my own anxiety, and I realized that the tether wasn't just a safety device, it was a lifeline to sanity itself, the only thing reminding me that I was still alive in a place designed to erase memory, identity, and body alike. The trench stretched endlessly ahead, and even as I adjusted my orientation, careful not to slacken the line, I knew that this was only the beginning of the tests the abyss had in store. Every shadow, every flicker of light, every subtle shift in pressure demanded vigilance and respect. The tether was my constant, my reminder, my lifeline. Without it taut and steady, I would have no reference, no control, no hope. The Mariana Trench had a way of teaching lessons slowly, patiently, and with deadly consequence. And I knew that the discipline instilled by Rule 3 would be essential for every moment that remained in this suffocating alien world. Even as I cautiously adjusted the tether, the shadows stretching endlessly around me, I remembered Rule 4. Never let the lights guide your path. Always trust your instruments, feeling its weight more keenly than any physical pressure. The faint bioluminescent glows in the distance flickered like false stars, almost hypnotic, threatening to lure me off course if I gave in to curiosity. Every instinct screamed to follow the lights, to drift toward their eerie rhythm, but I knew that would be a fatal mistake. I kept my eyes fixed on my compass and depth gauge, letting the instruments dictate each deliberate movement, my hands shaking slightly as I clutched the controls. The trench seemed alive, every shadow a potential predator, every flicker a temptation, and my survival depended entirely on ignoring what my eyes desperately wanted to follow. As I moved along a jagged ridge, I felt the tug of the tether remind me that my orientation and focus were everything. The water was colder here, thicker somehow, pressing in through every seam of my suit, and I knew the trench was testing not just my body, but my discipline. Glances at the distant glows were unavoidable, teasing me, shifting with a rhythm that felt almost conscious. I reminded myself again why Rule 4 existed. Following the lights was a trap, an invitation into depths where instruments were the only true guide. My heartbeat quickened as currents nudged me unpredictably, and I felt the terrifying fragility of human perception against the trench's infinite darkness. The canyon opened wider, and the distant light seemed to spread across the walls, forming shapes that my mind tried to interpret, giving them almost intentional movement. My instruments told me one story: direction, depth, tether tension, but my eyes betrayed me, catching shadows that seemed alive, as if they were mocking my reliance on metal and glass. I whispered into the comms, "Ignore them, focus on the readings," though my own voice wavered with fear. The trench pressed silently, cold and indifferent, and the knowledge that one wrong drift could be my last was a constant invisible weight. I adjusted my buoyancy and orientation meticulously, letting the instruments guide every inch, and praying my resolve would hold. Hours passed in that alien expanse, my mind balancing the tension of the tether, the cold and the hypnotic lights. Every flicker at the periphery threatened to pull me toward disaster, and I felt the panic of those who had ignored Rule 4 echo through my thoughts. The Mariana Trench had no mercy for visual temptation. It demanded focus, calculation, and obedience. I forced myself to breathe slowly, measuring every action against my instruments, resisting the overwhelming desire to follow the dancing glows. The deeper I went, the more the trench seemed to anticipate mistakes, currents brushing against me with the subtlety of living fingers, testing whether I would yield. Even as I rounded another ridge, the lights seemed to react, flickering in ways that suggested intent, teasing me with motion that felt conscious. I gripped the tether tighter, reminding myself silently that only instruments could anchor me to reality. The instruments showed stable readings, guiding me safely through depressions and narrow channels that were invisible to the eye. Shadows darted along the walls, fleeting forms that hinted at movement and intelligence, and I felt the suffocating weight of isolation pressing deeper into my chest. Every pulse of light was a test, and I realized the trench's true challenge wasn't physical, it was psychological, warping perception to lure the unwary. My buddy floated ahead, tether taut, and eyes also locked on his instruments, a faint silhouette against the oppressive darkness. I spoke into the comms, voice hushed, "Remember, don't follow the lights," knowing he understood as well as I did that the abyss punished disobedience instantly. The canyon seemed endless, walls twisting in ways that defied normal perception, and the distant glows, though beautiful, were dangerous illusions. Each movement required recalculating depth, orientation, and tether alignment, keeping instruments as the only source of truth. I realized that Rule 4 was not just caution, it was a lifeline, the boundary separating survival from being lost forever in the trench's deceptive maze. Currents shifted unexpectedly, nudging me sideways and testing my focus, while the lights flickered in patterns almost too deliberate to be random. I forced myself to resist every urge to glance directly at them, relying entirely on the compass and gauges to maintain direction. The trench seemed alive with awareness, as though each subtle glow responded to hesitation, measuring resolve and punishing doubt. My grip on the tether and instruments was a silent prayer, a physical and mental anchor against the hypnotic pull of the abyss. Every second, every meter, demanded attention. One slip, one look, and the lights could drag me into a spiral from which there would be no return. Hours continued to stretch without relief, the glow remaining distant but omnipresent, tempting with its silent pulse. I felt the trench pressing, invisible yet absolute, aware of my reliance on instruments, and perhaps testing the limits of human patience and discipline. Shadows darted at the edge of vision, strange forms that could have been nothing or everything, but the instruments gave me the only guidance I could trust. I whispered again to myself, never follow the lights, only the readings, a mantra drilled into me by training, reinforced by every lesson of the Mariana Trench. The abyss demanded vigilance, and Rule 4 was a razor-sharp boundary between life and death, a lesson I had no intention of forgetting. By the time we reached a slightly wider corridor, the lights remained distant, teasing from the edges, and I understood that the real danger of the trench wasn't in creatures or pressure, it was in letting the senses betray logic. My instruments guided me safely past every ridge and depression, every potential trap disguised as a gentle glow, and I felt a grim satisfaction in having resisted the hypnotic temptation. I glanced at my buddy, and we shared the silent acknowledgement that the abyss had observed our discipline, weighing patience and adherence against curiosity. The tether, instruments, and rules were our only allies here, and every step forward required complete obedience. As I drifted deeper, the glow finally faded from sight, but the lesson lingered, embedding itself in my mind like the cold pressure on my chest. I understood that Rule 4 was far more than guidance, it was survival itself. Every pulse of light could have been a predator, a trap, or a hallucination crafted by isolation and darkness, yet the instruments remained steadfast, silent, and true. I whispered a final reassurance, always trust the readings, knowing the Mariana Trench had only just begun to test me. The lights were gone for now, but the memory of their seductive pull would follow me, a constant reminder that obedience, discipline, and trust in what could be measured were the only things keeping me alive in this unyielding alien world. The canyon narrowed sharply ahead, shadows stretching like claws from the trench walls, and I felt the weight of Rule 5. Never enter a crevice narrower than your suit, no matter how safe it looks, pressing heavily in my mind. The light from my instruments bounced off jagged edges, revealing gaps that seemed shallow yet hinted at hidden depths beyond. My curiosity warred with my training, the instinct to explore nearly overriding the drilled caution, but I forced myself to hesitate, knowing that even a single miscalculation could trap me in an inescapable choke of water and rock. I could feel the cold pressing more insistently here, every subtle current a warning that the trench was patient, methodical, and unyielding. My buddy drifted a few meters ahead, and I could sense his caution, our shared awareness a thin tether against the suffocating pressure in isolation. I floated along the edge of a narrow fissure, the dark crevice inviting like a mouth opening into the unknown. My instruments read stable depth and pressure, yet the trench whispered in subtle currents that the readings were not the only things to trust. I reminded myself again of Rule 5, silently repeating it like a mantra, and refused to let the temptation of the narrow passage sway me. Shadows shifted inside the crevice, shapes too ambiguous to categorize, flickering with a light of their own that wasn't entirely natural. I gripped my tether and adjusted my buoyancy carefully, aware that any slip could wedge me into a trap where even the tether might not save me. The trench seemed to watch, waiting for the moment I would question the rule, the moment I would let curiosity override survival. The ridge above me jutted sharply, and my flashlight beam caught reflections in the water that created illusions of depth and movement. I forced my mind to rely on instruments, as Rule 5 instructed, knowing that visual cues here could betray even the most disciplined diver. Every shadow could conceal a sudden drop or a lethal obstruction, and even minor hesitation could be fatal. My suit felt tighter in the narrowing passage, as if the trench itself were testing whether I would remain obedient or yield to instinct. I reminded myself that the crevice might appear shallow, deceptively safe, but the Mariana Trench was a master of illusions, creating hazards where none seemed apparent. I focused intently on tether tension and instrument readings, forcing every motion to be deliberate, careful, and precise. As I edged past the first obstacle, a subtle current twisted unexpectedly around the ridge, and I felt the water press in on my suit like invisible hands. The pressure reminded me why Rule 5 existed, not as an arbitrary limit but as a boundary between calculated exploration and death. Shadows flickered deeper inside the crevice, the water vibrating faintly as if something alive moved just beyond reach. I whispered into the comms, "Keep your distance," partly for my buddy's benefit, partly to calm the rising tension in my own mind. The trench was patient, its silence a constant reminder that breaking the rule even slightly could trap me forever, leaving nothing but a suit and tether floating as evidence. Minutes blurred into hours as I navigated the narrowing canyon, every ridge and depression a potential trap. My eyes darted to every flicker, every subtle movement of particles or light, but I forced myself to obey Rule 5, refusing to risk a crevice that seemed even slightly smaller than my suit. My buddy drifted silently alongside, our instruments confirming that our path was safe. Yet the unseen pressures of the trench made every step feel like a negotiation with death itself. The faint glow of distant bioluminescence teased at the edges of perception, suggesting passages that were forbidden by the rule. I clutched the tether, aware that it alone tethered my mind to the fragile reality of life and survival. As the trench walls curved tighter, the shadows deepened, creating illusions of openings that weren't there. I fought the instinct to explore, my heart thudding with the desire to see what might lie beyond, and the cold pressed on my chest as if the trench were testing every ounce of restraint. I reminded myself again of Rule 5 in a whisper, clinging to the only certainty I had. Obeying the rules kept me alive. Curiosity could kill me instantly. The currents nudged at my suit unpredictably, a subtle but constant reminder that even a minor mistake could wedge me into a crevice that would crush or trap me. I adjusted my orientation carefully, following the line of tether and trusting only the instruments, keeping my mind as disciplined as my body. Hours of careful maneuvering passed as I traced the contours of the canyon, the trench alive with imperceptible motion, pushing and twisting the water in ways my mind struggled to comprehend. Every inch demanded attention, every movement had to be measured, every glance restrained. Rule 5 was more than a guideline, it was survival. I saw the faintest suggestion of another narrow passage, almost too tempting to ignore, and my chest tightened as the trench seemed to dare me to test it. I forced myself to turn away, letting instruments guide the path rather than the illusions of space and light. Shadows lingered, flickered, and disappeared, leaving a constant tension that gnawed at my nerves while my tether reminded me I was still anchored to reality. By the time I reached a wider corridor, the crevice behind me seemed like a warning in solid form, its darkness a quiet promise of consequences to anyone foolish enough to enter. I floated carefully, adjusting buoyancy, grateful that adherence to Rule 5 had kept me intact so far. The trench's pressure, isolation, and the hypnotic pull of forbidden openings were constant, invisible threats, yet I felt a measure of reassurance in having obeyed. My buddy drifted silently, tether taut, eyes scanning instruments like mine, and I knew we shared a silent understanding. The Mariana Trench tested patience, obedience, and respect, and Rule 5 had proven essential for survival. I exhaled slowly, aware that the lesson would remain etched in my mind long after the descent, a constant reminder that rules here were not suggestions, they were lifelines. The moment I drifted into a slightly wider corridor, after narrowly avoiding the deceptive crevices, I felt an unmistakable chill settling into my bones. A cold that wasn't merely from the depth, but something far more insidious, reminding me of Rule 6. Never ignore the temperature drop. It signals more than just depth. My breath condensed in the visor, a ghostly fog trailing with each exhale, and I could feel the cold pressing deeper than before, wrapping around my limbs as if it were alive. The instruments showed minor fluctuation in water temperature, but my instincts screamed that something unseen lurked in the shadows, waiting to exploit hesitation. The trench felt like it had noticed, somehow aware that my attention had wandered for just a heartbeat, testing whether I could recognize danger before it arrived. I clenched my fists and adjusted buoyancy, feeling the suit tighten as if the abyss itself were grasping at me, a reminder that the rules existed to protect against more than physical threats. The deeper I drifted, the colder the water became, sliding into my suit and numbing fingers and toes in a way that made each movement deliberate and slow. Shadows stretched across jagged walls, and faint glows illuminated strange shapes drifting just out of focus, teasing the eye. I could feel the trench studying me, testing whether I could maintain focus under pressure, cold, and fear, reminding me that ignoring the temperature drop was tantamount to inviting disaster. My buddy's silhouette floated nearby, tether taut, instruments alive with faint readings that reflected a subtle but undeniable change in the surrounding environment. I whispered to myself, "Don't ignore it, don't ignore it," letting the mantra of Rule 6 anchor me to discipline in the unrelenting abyss. Currents shifted subtly, nudging my suit against the walls, and I noticed that the temperature drop seemed to deepen around specific ridges, almost like a deliberate signal. Shadows danced in unnatural patterns along the rock faces, creating illusions of movement that played tricks on perception. I realized that the Mariana Trench wasn't just a place of pressure and darkness, it had an awareness of sorts, feeding off hesitation and distraction. Rule 6 wasn't about temperature alone. It was about paying attention to subtle signals that could mean the difference between life and death. I adjusted my grip on the tether and instruments, forcing every motion to be precise, every glance carefully measured. The cold pressed harder, almost tactile, and I felt an unfamiliar dread coiling in my chest, reminding me that even obeying previous rules wasn't enough if I ignored the signs of the abyss. Hours passed as I drifted past sharp ridges and shadowed hollows, every inch demanding vigilance, every flicker in the water requiring interpretation. The temperature continued to drop in uneven patches, and I understood it as a warning, a hidden guide that the trench had developed over millennia. I whispered into the comms, voice barely audible, "Temperature's dropping here, stay alert," hoping my buddy felt the same unease. Even the faintest lapse in attention could have disastrous consequences, as the trench could exploit disorientation, fear, and hesitation. Rule 6 had become an unspoken rhythm in my mind, a pulse that guided each movement, while the deep, cold water whispered of unseen hazards. As the canyon widened slightly, the cold seemed to thicken the water, making movements sluggish, every adjustment in buoyancy and tether feel laborious. Shadows swirled with an almost sentient motion, and the faint bioluminescent glows in the distance seemed more deliberate, pulsing in a rhythm that made my pulse quicken. I reminded myself silently that Rule 6 was as much about observation as it was about physical safety. Ignoring temperature shifts meant ignoring the trench's subtle communications. I traced my instruments obsessively, watching for fluctuations, noting each rise and fall as though the life of the dive depended on my attention, and it did. The cold was no longer just an environmental factor, it was an indicator of deeper, unseen dangers, pressing in psychologically as much as physically. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity as I navigated the canyon, every shadow suggesting hidden channels or creatures lurking beyond the light. The temperature continued to drop unevenly, and my mind conjured shapes in the darkness, some possibly real, some imagined, yet all requiring vigilance. I whispered again, never ignore the cold, letting Rule 6 guide my perception as I drifted carefully along the ridge, instruments my only reassurance. Currents tugged subtly at the tether, demanding that I constantly adjust, maintaining both orientation and mental focus. The trench felt alive, testing every ounce of resolve, reminding me that obedience to the rules was the only defense against being claimed by the abyss. The deeper I descended, the more pronounced the temperature anomalies became, pockets of ice-cold water pressing like fingers against my suit, juxtaposed with warmer currents that almost tricked the senses into false security. Shadows twisted with every flicker of my flashlight, revealing jagged ridges that could easily trap an inattentive diver. I clutched the tether and instruments with renewed focus, repeating Rule 6 silently to myself as a mantra, a lifeline, a shield against both panic and disorientation. Every inch of the trench was a test of awareness, every temperature drop a signal that something unseen lurked in patience and darkness. I reminded myself that the trench didn't need to move to be dangerous. Its silence, shadows, and subtle shifts could kill as effectively as crushing pressure or sudden currents. As I drifted past a wide depression, the cold seemed to seep into my very thoughts, slowing reasoning, dragging focus into a haze that demanded renewed discipline. I observed the instruments obsessively, letting depth, oxygen, tether tension, and temperature guide each movement. My buddy's silhouette remained a faint beacon of discipline, and I realized that even companionship was fragile without adherence to the rules. The trench's pressure and cold were no longer merely physical factors, they were psychological predators designed to exploit any lapse. I forced myself to remain present, aware of each flicker, each vibration in the tether, and each subtle drop in temperature, knowing that Rule 6 was a barrier against death that was as real as the metal and glass protecting me. By the time I reached a slightly wider corridor, the temperature anomaly receded slightly, leaving a lingering cold that clung to the suit and mind alike. I exhaled slowly, acknowledging that Rule 6 had guided me through what could have been fatal pockets of the abyss, and I understood that the trench's warnings came not through sound or sight, but through subtle, insidious signals. Shadows retreated just enough to let instruments remain reliable, yet the unease lingered, a silent reminder that the Mariana Trench was patient, observing, and lethal. Every movement forward would require the same discipline, the same attention to detail, and the same unwavering respect for the unseen dangers indicated by temperature alone. I whispered again, almost in awe, never ignore the cold, as if invoking protection, knowing that the lesson would remain with me for every meter still ahead. The trench seemed to breathe around me, currents shifting like invisible hands as I moved cautiously along the widening canyon, and I recalled Rule 7, never respond to unknown noises. They are not what they seem, feeling its significance more sharply than ever. A faint hum echoed through the water, subtle enough that it could have been a trick of pressure or a distant creature, but instinct screamed it was deliberate, a lure designed to test attention and restraint. My buddy floated a few meters ahead, fingers clinging to the tether, both of us silently acknowledging the rule as we pressed forward. Every sound here was amplified, warped by the depth and water density, creating illusions that could mislead even the most disciplined diver. I reminded myself to rely solely on instruments and training, ignoring the hypnotic pull of curiosity, knowing that even a brief reaction could have disastrous consequences. The canyon narrowed again, the shadows dancing in unnatural patterns along the jagged walls, and the hum grew slightly louder, almost imperceptibly pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I forced myself to focus on the tether and instruments, repeating Rule 7 silently, resisting the urge to turn or call out in response. The Mariana Trench had an uncanny way of playing with perception. Sounds became deceptive predators, echoing in ways that made distance and direction impossible to judge. Every slight vibration of the water, every faint ripple across the walls, could indicate movement, pressure shifts, or unseen life forms lurking just beyond visibility. I gripped the tether tighter, adjusting buoyancy deliberately, and whispered to myself, "Ignore it, it's nothing," even as unease crawled up my spine. Hours of careful navigation stretched on as the trench pressed closer, shadows stretching longer and twisting unpredictably with each flicker of the flashlight. The hum persisted intermittently, a teasing thread that made the mind question reality. My buddy's breathing in the comms was a quiet anchor, confirming our discipline, but I knew that any lapse could allow the abyss to exploit instinct over reason. I reminded myself again that Rule 7 existed not to limit curiosity, but to ensure survival, that the trench was not only a physical danger, but a psychological one, manipulating perception with minimal effort. Every movement had to be precise, every thought disciplined, lest the sound become a trap. The deeper I moved, the more subtle noises began layering over one another. Distant clicks, the faint creaking of unseen ridges, and currents that whispered in ways almost intentional. I felt my pulse quicken, muscles tensing instinctively, but I reminded myself of Rule 7 and refused to respond. Even a turn of the head or a single shout could invite chaos, creating disorientation that the trench would exploit. Shadows flickered along ridges and within crevices, shapes that could have been creatures or tricks of light, yet all I did was adjust buoyancy and maintain tether tension. I realized that ignoring sounds required more than mental strength. It demanded a surrender to discipline that was uncomfortable, even terrifying, as if my very instincts were being tested for weakness. Hours blurred into an endless expanse as the abyss around me seemed alive, every subtle noise amplified into a symphony of potential threats. The hums, clicks, and ripples continued, each one a test of obedience, each one a reminder that Rule 7 was more than instruction, it was a lifeline. My instruments remained my only anchor, guiding movement and orientation, while the shadows and noises conspired to confuse the senses. I whispered again, "Do not respond," clinging to the tether and repeating the mantra of the rule. The Mariana Trench had a patience and awareness that defied understanding, and I understood that survival depended not on curiosity, but on the restraint to let unknown signals pass unnoticed. A sudden vibration along the tether drew my attention for a split second, but I forced myself to remain calm, reminding myself that responding to unknown noises was precisely what the rule forbade. The trench seemed to pulse around me, currents twisting in ways that could deceive even the trained eye, and yet I held my position, relying on instruments and rules. Every flicker of light along the canyon walls, every subtle shift of the water, was a reminder of the danger of yielding to instinct. My buddy mirrored my caution, both of us silently reinforcing the discipline that kept us alive. I realized that the trench's intelligence was not overt, but manifested in the manipulation of sensory perception, making Rule 7 a critical safeguard against psychological as well as physical threats. The canyon opened slightly into a wider corridor, shadows retreating just enough to reveal jagged ridges and depressions, but the faint hum persisted, echoing through the water like a distant predator testing patience. I floated carefully, allowing instruments to guide every movement, resisting the urge to locate the source of the sound. Rule 7 became a mantra in my mind, a shield against fear and curiosity, keeping me anchored as the trench seemed to warp around me. Every slight adjustment in tether tension, buoyancy, or orientation was deliberate, measured, and calculated, a dance of survival dictated by discipline over instinct. The abyss tested my resolve with every subtle vibration, and I clung to the rule as the line between life and being lost forever. Hours passed in the oppressive darkness, with noises coming and going, rising and falling like a tide. The trench was patient, observing every twitch of muscle, every heartbeat, every involuntary glance, and my adherence to Rule 7 was the only thing maintaining sanity and orientation. The lights flickered in the distance, the shadows stretched and morphed, yet I allowed none of it to dictate movement. Instruments remained my only guidance, tether my only certainty, and the rule my unbroken promise to myself. I whispered again, a quiet affirmation, "Never respond," as if vocalizing it could make the abyss respect my discipline. And slowly, the depth seemed slightly less oppressive, not safe, but survivable for now. By the time I reached a narrow ridge, the distant noises faded into the ambient hum of the trench, leaving only the cold, oppressive weight of water pressing in from every side. I exhaled slowly, acknowledging that Rule 7 had once again shielded me from a trap I might not have even consciously recognized. Shadows remained along the walls, flickering subtly, but the discipline of ignoring them had preserved my orientation and focus. My buddy's faint silhouette mirrored my own measured movements, both of us tethered not just physically but mentally, bound to the rules that kept the abyss from claiming us. Rule 7 had proven essential, and I knew the trench's patience meant that tests like these would continue indefinitely, each one more subtle and insidious than the last. The trench opened into an expansive, shadowed plateau, the walls looming like ancient sentinels, and I immediately remembered Rule 8. Never touch the ocean floor without checking for movement first. Feeling the weight of its importance as the cold pressed even deeper into my bones. The sediment below looked deceptively still, a smooth gray carpet stretching into darkness, but I knew better. My buddy hovered silently a few meters away, tether taut, and I watched as even the slightest disturbance in the water could indicate something unseen, alive, and potentially dangerous. Each movement of my hands or fins could send tremors through the fine silt, and the Mariana Trench had a way of exploiting curiosity, punishing those who acted without caution. I clenched my gloved hands, letting the instruments guide my path, knowing that hesitation could be as critical as action. As I drifted lower, a faint ripple disturbed the edge of the plateau, and my pulse quickened, each beat a reminder of why Rule 8 was so vital. Even at a depth measured in thousands of meters, subtle currents shifted unpredictably, revealing that the floor was far from static. Shadows danced across the sediment like living patterns, and I reminded myself silently to resist the urge to reach for anything immediately. I felt a tug on the tether, subtle but firm, as if the abyss itself were nudging me to test my resolve. Every movement had to be deliberate, every glance and adjustment calculated, because touching the ocean floor without awareness could unleash consequences beyond imagination. Hours passed in agonizing slowness as I navigated the plateau, each inch a test of patience and observation. Sediment shifted occasionally under unseen forces, and I observed every change like a hawk, adjusting my buoyancy to maintain exact positioning. I whispered to myself, check for movement first, letting Rule 8 guide every action as the trench seemed to hum with latent anticipation. Tiny bioluminescent creatures flitted just above the floor, flickering like stars in the black abyss, but I refused to chase them or touch the silt, knowing that even curiosity could be fatal. The cold pressed relentlessly, shadows seemed to lengthen and twist unnaturally, and every sound, muted but eerie in the depths, reinforced the necessity of discipline and vigilance. As I inched across a ridge, the sediment shifted slightly, a faint vibration through the tether and suit that caused my chest to tighten with apprehension. I realized the ocean floor was alive in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, responding to pressure, current, and possibly intelligence I could not comprehend. My buddy moved in silent synchronization, tether lines taut, instruments glowing faintly in the darkness. We navigated carefully, eyes on the gauges, buoyancy controlled meticulously, resisting every instinct to touch, prod, or investigate the floor. I whispered again, never touch without checking, letting the mantra of Rule 8 guide my attention as shadows flickered along the jagged ridges, seeming almost sentient in their deliberate motions. The plateau stretched on endlessly, with ridges rising like small mountains and depressions hiding unknown dangers. I had to constantly scan for movement before placing any weight or fin on the sediment, as even a slight misstep could trigger hidden creatures or disturb unstable formations that could trap or injure. The Mariana Trench revealed its cruelty in subtle ways, making the obedient diver navigate a path that was as much psychological as it was physical. I adjusted my orientation with each careful maneuver, trusting instruments and tether over instinct, and every ripple in the sediment reminded me of the trench's patient awareness. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, reacting to my presence, a chilling confirmation that Rule 8 was not a suggestion, but an absolute necessity. Minutes blurred into what felt like hours, as I edged across a deep depression, the ocean floor shifting under unseen influence. My hands hovered above the sediment, and I took deliberate, measured breaths, resisting the natural urge to touch and explore. Currents shifted subtly, and tiny particles rose and fell like whispers from the abyss, teasing and threatening in equal measure. I whispered again, "Check first, always," letting Rule 8 anchor my attention as the trench seemed to press closer with every movement. Even the faintest hesitation in observation could invite disaster. The abyss did not forgive carelessness, and I understood that the floor could conceal threats both alive and environmental, from sudden collapses to creatures hidden beneath the silt. Hours of careful observation continued, each inch demanding vigilance, as the trench revealed pockets of life and danger in ways too subtle to be perceived by sight alone. Tiny creatures scuttled along the floor, barely visible, while currents shifted the silt in silent patterns that seemed almost intentional. I adjusted tether tension and buoyancy constantly, letting instruments and training dictate each movement. Shadows flickered in the distance, creating the illusion of depth and shape, but I refused to respond impulsively, guided solely by Rule 8. The cold and pressure pressed relentlessly, and I understood that the ocean floor was not simply a surface to traverse. It was a living, reactive, and dangerous interface that demanded respect and patience. By the time I reached a slightly raised ridge, the plateau seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, but the sediment remained mostly undisturbed. I exhaled slowly, acknowledging the discipline that Rule 8 demanded and the survival it ensured. My buddy mirrored my movements, tether lines taut, both of us silently reinforcing the rule as we progressed. Shadows and currents whispered of unseen dangers, yet adherence to observation and restraint allowed progress through the alien, oppressive environment. I realized that every meter of the Mariana Trench was a psychological and physical test, and touching the ocean floor without awareness was a risk the abyss would punish mercilessly. The lesson of Rule 8 remained clear. Patience, observation, and disciplined restraint were the only paths to survival. The trench opened into a narrow corridor, lined with jagged, alien-like formations, and I immediately recalled Rule 9, never remove your helmet near unknown structures. The pressure is deceptive, a rule that now felt more like an instinct than an instruction. The structures jutted unpredictably from the ocean floor and walls, some smooth, some rough, some emitting faint, unidentifiable glows that beckoned with silent allure. My fingers tightened around the tether as I hovered carefully, reminding myself that even a single lapse, removing or loosening the helmet, could be fatal. The Mariana Trench seemed to watch, currents twisting subtly around the formations, creating illusions of motion and depth that the eye desperately tried to interpret. I whispered to my buddy, who floated silently beside me, "Helmet stays on, always," and he responded with a faint nod visible through his visor, both of us acknowledging the invisible, omnipresent danger. The structures seemed to pulsate faintly, almost as if they were alive, and shadows stretched unpredictably across the cavern walls. My instruments confirmed that pressure and depth were stable, yet the water's density seemed to warp around the jagged ridges. Every instinct screamed to remove the helmet for a better view, a closer inspection, but Rule 9 anchored me in discipline. The faint glow from the formations hinted at textures and surfaces that could easily tempt even the most cautious diver. I gripped my tether and instruments tighter, forcing my eyes to focus solely on readings rather than the hypnotic illusions of shape, movement, and light. The trench, with its alien patience, seemed to wait for a single moment of weakness, knowing curiosity was a diver's most dangerous enemy. Hours passed in a tense, deliberate crawl along the corridor, the structures rising like alien monoliths, casting shadows that shifted unpredictably with each flicker of the flashlight. I reminded myself silently of Rule 9, resisting every instinct to remove or adjust the helmet, understanding that the Mariana Trench had killed more for curiosity than for misjudged movement. Even the smallest act of exposure could allow the pressure to crush or disorient, and I clung to the tether as if it were the only thing separating sanity from chaos. The shadows played tricks, forming shapes that seemed sentient, yet I moved with caution, buoyancy and tether guiding each inch. My buddy mirrored my exact movements, our instruments glowing faintly in silent coordination, an unspoken pact of survival. The deeper we ventured, the more the pressure felt deceptive, wrapping around the helmet in a way that made every small shift significant. Subtle currents bent around the formations, creating pockets where the water density increased, threatening to pull or twist the suit unexpectedly. The temptation to remove the helmet just slightly for comfort or curiosity was intense, but I forced myself to obey Rule 9. I observed every shadow, every flicker, every ripple in the water, as if the trench itself were alive, aware of hesitation or distraction. The structures themselves seemed to anticipate human error, creating optical and sensory illusions designed to tempt a diver into a fatal lapse. Minutes bled into hours as we navigated past the formations, each step demanding unwavering attention. The Mariana Trench was relentless in its subtle tests, the pressure deceptive, currents misleading, and shadows alive with possibilities I could not fully comprehend. I adjusted my tether and buoyancy with extreme care, knowing that any sudden movement could amplify the deceptive pressure effects, potentially compromising the helmet's seal. My buddy drifted alongside silently, a reassuring shadow of discipline, but the constant pull of curiosity whispered in every pulse of bioluminescent light. Rule 9 became a mantra, repeated silently in my mind, guiding each decision with absolute precision. The structures grew denser, creating narrow passages and jagged protrusions that challenged navigation. Every meter required careful measurement and strict reliance on instruments, because the pressure in these confined areas could rise unpredictably, bending perception and threatening suit integrity. I reminded myself again of Rule 9, resisting the urge to adjust, remove or even touch the helmet in any way. Even the smallest lapse could prove fatal, the Mariana Trench offering no second chances. Shadows and subtle glows made the corridor appear alive, teasing the senses, but I clung to the discipline that had preserved my life through the previous rules. Hours continued in oppressive silence, punctuated only by faint movements of water around the formations, ripples that could have been nothing, or could have signaled something alive lurking in the folds of rock and silt. My hands hovered close to the tether and instruments, buoyancy adjusted perfectly to maintain position without touching anything. Every instinct to explore with bare hands or remove the helmet was met with the stern reminder of Rule 9, anchoring me to survival, even as the trench seemed to test patience and resolve. Shadows lengthened, creating hallucinations of corridors, tunnels, and openings, but instruments and adherence to rules remained the only reliable guide. By the time we reached a wider corridor, the structures seemed to recede slightly, though their presence was still oppressive, casting long, twisting shadows across the trench floor. I exhaled slowly, acknowledging that Rule 9 had once again preserved life in an environment where curiosity could be lethal. My buddy mirrored my exact movements, tether taut and instruments guiding progress, both of us silently reinforcing the discipline. Shadows flickered in the distance, currents whispered along unseen ridges, and I understood that the Mariana Trench would continue to test obedience, patience, and attention. Rule 9 had proven essential once again. Helmets stay sealed, curiosity deferred, and instruments trusted, because the abyss offered no forgiveness for error. The corridor opened into a cavernous expanse, currents twisting unpredictably like invisible predators, and I immediately felt the weight of Rule 10. Never underestimate the currents. They carry more than water pressing against every limb. The water moved with a subtle, insidious intelligence, shifting in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, guiding or pushing me toward unseen dangers. My buddy hovered nearby, tether taut, both of us fully aware that a single miscalculation could send either of us spinning into shadows or jagged ridges. The Mariana Trench had taught me that currents were far more than natural forces. They were vectors of unseen peril, carrying pressure, sediment, and perhaps something alive beyond comprehension. I adjusted my buoyancy carefully, letting instruments dictate every movement, while ignoring the hypnotic pull of the flowing abyss. As I drifted deeper into the cavern, the currents became stronger, twisting around ridges and structures, forcing constant micro-adjustments in orientation and tether tension. The water pressed insistently against my suit, a sensation both physical and psychological, as if the trench were asserting control over movement and thought. Rule 10 whispered constantly in my mind, reminding me that currents could carry debris, sediment, or even creatures into lethal contact before a diver could react. Shadows danced with each fluctuation, creating illusions of depth and space that were impossible to trust. I focused on instruments, tether and buoyancy adjustments alone, knowing that instinctive reactions to the flowing water could be fatal. Hours passed as I navigated the twisting currents, each one stronger and more unpredictable than the last, testing endurance, patience, and attention. Tiny bioluminescent shapes darted through the water, seemingly carried by the currents in deliberate arcs that challenged perception and balance. I reminded myself silently of Rule 10, using every ounce of discipline to resist instinctive reactions to the tugging and twisting of the water. My buddy's movements were precise, matching mine exactly, tether lines taut and instruments glowing faintly in the blackness. Even the slightest misalignment or hesitation could allow the current to push a diver into hidden ridges or unstable sediment, making obedience to Rule 10 an invisible but critical shield against disaster. The currents intensified unexpectedly around a narrow ridge, swirling like invisible funnels, and I realized that the Mariana Trench was not just an environment, it was a predator, using water movement to manipulate, disorient, and test the mind. Rule 10 became a mantra, silently guiding every adjustment, every movement, every breath. Shadows lengthened and twisted unpredictably, and the faint glow from distant formations created optical illusions that tempted instinct to react. I forced each movement to be calculated, precise, and deliberate, letting instruments and tether dictate my path, while ignoring every subtle suggestion of motion in the water that might have lured me toward danger. Minutes bled into hours, the currents carving unseen paths through the trench, sometimes tugging gently, sometimes violently, each fluctuation a test of focus. Sediment rose and fell with the flow, obscuring vision and creating sudden pockets of resistance or instability. I whispered again to myself, never underestimate them, letting Rule 10 anchor awareness and calm as the Mariana Trench tested patience and reaction simultaneously. Every movement demanded extreme caution, as even a momentary lapse could send a diver spinning into darkness, or worse, a crevice too narrow to escape. Shadows flickered in rhythm with the currents, creating the illusion of entities moving through the water, but adherence to the rule remained my only safeguard. As I edged along the cavern floor, the currents twisted around unexpected ridges, carrying a mixture of silt, detritus, and strange glimmers that reflected light in disorienting patterns. I adjusted tether and buoyancy constantly, following instruments and ignoring the deceptive pull of the water. The Mariana Trench seemed to play with perception itself, testing whether instinct or discipline would dominate. Rule 10 guided me silently, ensuring that each movement considered the unseen subtle threats carried by the flow. My buddy remained close, their shadow a reassuring presence in the blackness, both of us floating like disciplined marionettes, obedient to the invisible hand of the abyss. The deeper I ventured, the more pronounced the currents became, twisting and weaving like serpents, carrying particles and shadows in ways that defied ordinary physics. I observed patterns in the movement, subtle cues that allowed prediction, but demanded full attention and compliance with Rule 10. One wrong adjustment, one instinctive reaction, and the current could spin me into a wall or a sudden drop, leaving no margin for survival. Shadows lengthened and compressed, light danced across ridges unpredictably, and the trench seemed alive, intelligent, patient, and deadly. I whispered once more, never underestimate them, as I guided every movement through calculation, discipline, and focus alone. Hours dragged on as the cavern widened, and currents became a complex labyrinth, twisting, pushing, and pulling in unpredictable arcs. Tiny bioluminescent streaks of light danced within the water, following the currents, creating patterns that seemed almost intentional, as if the trench were demonstrating its awareness of every movement. Instruments remained my anchor, tether my lifeline, and Rule 10 my constant mental safeguard. I forced my eyes to trust readings over perception, ignoring the hypnotic motions of flowing water that seemed alive, sentient, and omnipresent. Each adjustment of buoyancy or orientation required exact calculation, resisting instinctive reactions to the push and pull that might otherwise have betrayed survival. By the time I reached a slightly calmer section, the current seemed less aggressive, but the water still whispered its subtle threats, carrying sediment, tiny organisms, and invisible pressure fluctuations along hidden paths. I exhaled slowly, acknowledging that Rule 10 had once again preserved life by reminding me that currents were more than mere water. They were vectors of unseen danger, conduits of the trench's patient and deadly influence. My buddy floated silently, tether taut, instruments glowing faintly, a shared understanding of survival through adherence to the rule. Shadows lingered, flickering across ridges and depressions, but discipline and obedience ensured that each movement remained deliberate and safe. The lesson of Rule 10 was clear. Currents were alive in their own way, and respect, caution, and absolute attention were the only shields against the abyss. The abyss opened into a vast, uncharted expanse, dim bioluminescent glows flickering in the distance, like dying stars, and I immediately felt the weight of Rule 11. Never let curiosity guide you beyond the lights. Some paths are meant to be unseen, pressing against my mind and chest. The trench seemed endless, the pressure heavier, the shadows longer and more deliberate than anything I had faced before. My buddy hovered a few meters ahead, tethered taut, instruments faintly pulsing, both of us fully aware that even a single misstep could lead us into the unknown, where no rule could save a diver. Every flicker of distant light drew the eye, tempting instinct, but I forced myself to obey, remembering the countless times the abyss had punished curiosity before. The Mariana Trench was patient and intelligent, teaching that survival was not about exploration but discipline, and that Rule 11 was the ultimate guardian against the deadly lure of the unseen. As we moved forward, the dim lights formed patterns in the distance, illuminating jagged ridges, depressions, and strange structures that seemed almost organic, breathing subtly in the crushing water. I felt a magnetic pull toward them, a whispering voice of curiosity that urged me to investigate, to float closer and witness what the trench held in its cold embrace. But Rule 11 anchored me to reason, reminding me that some paths were meant to remain unseen, that even the slightest deviation from obedience could unleash unseen horrors. Shadows stretched across the canyon floor, stretching and twisting with currents, creating illusions of tunnels, passages, and voids that might not exist. I clutched the tether and instruments tightly, repeating the rules silently as a lifeline against instinctive temptation, knowing the trench thrived on curiosity. Hours of careful navigation dragged on, every flicker of light a test of discipline, every subtle current tugging at both tether and mind. Tiny bioluminescent creatures drifted in seemingly deliberate arcs, highlighting depressions and ridges that might conceal threats or wonders alike. I whispered to my buddy, "Stay with the lights, don't follow further," and he mirrored my movements with silent obedience. The Mariana Trench was alive in its subtle manipulations, currents, shadows, and lights conspiring to test every ounce of resolve. Every inch of movement required absolute attention, instruments over instinct, obedience over curiosity, or we risked vanishing into the unseen darkness where the abyss held dominion. As the corridor narrowed again, the lights ahead formed a faintly spiraling pattern along the canyon walls, as if beckoning divers towards something extraordinary, terrifying, or both. My pulse quickened, the cold pressed deeper, and the shadows seemed to elongate with intention, as if reaching for me. I reminded myself once again of Rule 11, resisting every instinctive urge to follow the mysterious spiral of light. The trench was patient, relentless, testing whether training and discipline could overcome the primal human urge to explore the unknown. My buddy remained a shadow of precise movements. Tether and instruments our only connection to safety in the oppressive alien environment. Every flicker, every pulse of light, every shadow tested obedience, and I clung to Rule 11 like a shield against the invisible predator of the abyss. Minutes bled into hours, the spiraling lights continuing just out of reach, teasing perception and patience. The currents twisted subtly, creating illusions of motion and depth that threatened to lure both divers off course. I forced each movement to be deliberate, adjusting buoyancy with exacting care, monitoring every fluctuation in pressure, tether tension, and instrument readings. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along ridges, as if alive, but I resisted every urge to investigate, to drift beyond the faint glow of safety. Rule 11 was a lifeline, a guardrail against a fascination that the Mariana Trench had weaponized over millennia, punishing those who succumbed to curiosity with swift, unseen horror. The deeper we descended, the more intense the illusion of hidden passages and glowing caverns became. Tiny currents carried faintly glowing particles, tracing pathways into darkness that begged to be followed. I forced myself to stay anchored to the main corridor, eyes fixed on instruments, tether taut, every muscle alert and disciplined. Shadows flickered in rhythmic, deliberate patterns, forming shapes that almost seemed alive, teasing the mind with phantom presences. Rule 11 whispered insistently in my thoughts. Do not follow the lights. Some paths are meant to be unseen, and I obeyed, knowing that one misstep could unleash consequences that no tether or instrument could rescue us from. Hours passed in this tense rhythm, each flicker of light more hypnotic than the last, each shadow more deliberate in its subtle manipulation. I became acutely aware of every heartbeat, every breath, every tiny movement in the water, using Rule 11 as a mental anchor against the magnetic pull of the unknown. The trench seemed to pulse with intelligence, currents twisting as if alive, guiding the mind toward fascination while threatening the body with hidden dangers. My buddy mirrored every careful move, tether taut, instruments glowing faintly, both of us bound by discipline and a shared understanding that curiosity in this place was lethal. Shadows, light, and pressure converged to test every decision, reinforcing the truth of Rule 11. Some paths were meant to remain unseen. As we reached the farthest edge of the lighted corridor, the glow dimmed, leaving only faint bioluminescence and oppressive shadows that twisted across the trench floor. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of survival resting on obedience to Rule 11, recognizing that the Mariana Trench's lessons had been relentless but absolute. The currents twisted subtly, sediment floated in ghostly arcs, and shadows shifted unpredictably, yet adherence to the rule preserved clarity and control. My buddy drifted in mirrored precision, instruments glowing faintly, tether taut, both of us tethered not just physically, but mentally to the rules that had kept us alive. Finally, as the corridor ended in an abyssal void, the last glimmers of light flickered out, leaving only darkness and the oppressive presence of the trench. I realized that Rule 11 had been the ultimate safeguard, a shield against the unknown that demanded more discipline than any other. The Mariana Trench had revealed its patience, intelligence, and danger, teaching that survival was as much about obedience as skill. Shadows lingered, currents whispered, and the silence pressed in with the weight of eternity, leaving the abyss unresolved, a reminder that some paths must never be taken. I exhaled slowly, the tether taut between my buddy and me, instruments dimly pulsing in the eternal black, and whispered to myself, never follow beyond the lights, knowing that this rule, like all the others, would haunt every descent into the deep for the rest of my life. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.